Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. In one of my recent History News lives, I recounted a conversation that I had had with a visitor while I was doing some live costume historical interpretation at a heritage site. On this particular occasion, I was representing a suffragette, and so I was discussing points that were relevant to both that costume and that character. I had a brilliant time, full of interesting conversations, but one conversation in particular really stayed with me, and it's ultimately what has inspired me to make today's video. Unsurprisingly, I think, considering how I was dressed, I spent much of my time talking about the fight for votes for women and more generally for equal franchise as a whole. The visitor in question asked me when black people were first allowed to vote in Britain. Now, before I take on any interpretation role, I do a lot of research about the character that I'm going to be playing, the time in which they lived, and any other additional context that may be useful. So, in order to prepare for this role, I made sure to brush up on a variety of things, including the history of various protest movements with regard to this subject, legal challenges, and any dates when shifts occurred, and also the form that those shifts ultimately took. Thus, I could respond that voting in Britain was restricted to adult males, meaning over 21, who met certain property ownership and residence qualifications, regardless of their race. This conversation, however, did inspire me to go researching further, and that has led me to want to make this particular video. Because today, I want to explore the life and legacy of the first known black person to have met these voting requirements and to have thus voted in a British election. His name was Ignatius Sancho. Let's take a look at him. Ignatius was born in around 1729 on a slave ship that was bound for the West Indies. He was baptised in the Spanish colony of New Granada. His mother would fall ill and die soon after his birth, and according to Vincent Corretta, his father then took his own life, quote, rather than endure slavery. Parts of this account of Ignatius's early life have, however, been challenged. Harry Sherrin explains that, quote, the most substantial source relating to Sancho's early years is a 1782 posthumous biography written by Joseph Jekyll. It's worth noting that the accuracy of Jekyll's accounts has been criticised in recent years. In Jekyll's narrative, Sancho was born in the late 1720s on a slave ship traversing the Middle Passage from Guinea in Africa to the Spanish West Indies in the Caribbean. Sancho himself, however, alluded to having been born in Africa in one of his letters. What happened next is clearer. While he was still a toddler, Ignatius, enslaved and apparently orphaned, was taken to Greenwich and placed in the household of 3 unmarried sisters. These new enslavers gave him the name Sancho, as they thought he resembled Don Quixote's companion. His intelligence was recognised and remarked upon by a visitor to their home, John, Duke of Montagu. In the face of the sisters' refusal to educate Ignatius, the Duke would occasionally take him to his home, and when there, would give him books to read. The Duke died in 1749. Soon afterwards, Ignatius sought the protection of the Duke's widow, Mary. Now, this Mary is the daughter of Queen Anne's erstwhile favourite, Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough. Mary was eventually prevailed upon to hire Ignatius as her butler, which was a very senior position within the hierarchy of domestic staff during this period. When Mary died in 1751, she left Ignatius a year's salary plus an annuity of £30. If we use the currency converter from the National Archives, we discover that £30 in 1750 would be the equivalent of £3,500 and 8 pence in 2017's money. It was also the equivalent of 300 days of wages for a skilled tradesman. Ignatius Sancho, thus, I would say, had enough money to be more than comfortable. Ignatius married Anne Osborne on the 17th of December 1758 at St Margaret's Church in Westminster. Between 1761 and 1775, this couple would have 7 children, and perhaps the demands of this growing family provided the impetus that would lead Ignatius to return to serve the Montagu family. In 1766, he was employed as a valet by John and Mary's son-in-law George, who was now the new Duke of Montagu. As a valet, Ignatius was George's personal attendant, and this role required proximity to his employer at various points in the day. This duke was a courtier who had been made governor and captain of Windsor Castle in 1752. Evidently, he was a person trusted within the royal family because in 1776, so 10 years after Ignatius became his valet, the Duke was made governor of the Prince of Wales, who at this time was the future George IV. He was also made governor to this prince's brother, Frederick, the Duke of York. The Duke of Montagu was thus moving in incredibly rarefied circles throughout the time that Ignatius was employed by him as a valet, and so by extension, Ignatius was thus often in the presence of nobles, royals, and others of influence. In 1766, Ignatius was moved to write to Laurence Sterne, the clergyman and also novelist who was responsible for the Tristram Shandy series, among other works. Ignatius wanted to encourage him, successfully as it would turn out, to continue to lobby for the abolition of the slave trade. On the 29th of November 1768, Ignatius met with Thomas Gainsborough, who painted his portrait. This portrait. We know that from almost the start of his interactions with the Dukes of Montagu, Ignatius had access, to varying degrees, to that family's library. But it would appear that as time went on, he would also receive their support in his artistic pursuits, in addition to getting the time and space to dedicate to them. Because in around 1766, Ignatius Sancho published a collection of his musical compositions. These were minuets, cotillions, and country dances. So, for the most part, seemingly upbeat works that were designed to be danced to. This first work was dedicated to George, Duke of Montagu. The next collection of compositions that Ignatius produced and published were dedicated to the Duke of Montagu's son, John. It is thought that the Duke of Montagu may have provided financial backing for these publications. Ignatius would dedicate another collection of works to Anne Brudenell, who was the wife of the Duke of Montagu's younger brother. Then, when Ignatius came to publish a further collection of his compositions in 1776, he would dedicate them to Charlotte, the Princess Royal. 3 years after this, in 1779, he dedicated another published collection to the Prime Minister of the day's daughter, Catherine Ann North. Ignatius Sancho is also thought to have written and published A Theory of Music, which is now lost, 2 plays, also lost, in addition to numerous letters and articles, and in some cases he wrote these under the pseudonym Africanus, but for the rest he used his own name. In these writings, in addition to expressing his vociferous support for the abolitionist movement, Ignatius also expressed his loyalty to the monarchy, and he wrote of his hopes for the success of British forces in the American Revolutionary War. Besides this, though, he could count some of the most famous artists, actors, musicians, and writers of his age as his personal friends and acquaintances. He acted as a patron for both black and white aspiring artists and authors. As Ignatius got older, his health did begin to deteriorate, and ultimately he became unable to meet the physical demands of being a valet. With his wife at his side, and with some assistance from the Duke of Montagu, Ignatius opened a grocery shop on the 29th of January 1774. This shop was located at 20 Charles Street in Westminster. It is thought to be very likely that, in addition to his other wares, Ignatius would have stocked and sold goods that had been harvested by enslaved people in the Americas and the West Indies. By all accounts, his business was a successful one. Nevertheless, Ignatius would complain of having money troubles at fairly regular intervals. It is unclear how real these troubles were and how pressing, or whether they were due to a desire for some continuing betterment, or perhaps resulted from the real costs of supporting his family, or perhaps some overspending on his part. However real and pressing these monetary concerns may have been, Ignatius was certainly secure enough to maintain his place as a property owner until the end of his life. This in turn qualified him to vote in the parliamentary elections of 1774 and 1780. And in the case of both these elections, we know who he voted for. As the team at the British Library point out, quote, "In the 18th century there was no secret ballot. Voting was a completely open process, and there was a public record of exactly who voted for whom in each constituency." The library holds a copy of the poll from October 1774, in which Ignatius Sancho is listed as a tea dealer in Charles Street, which is in the St Margaret's and St John's Parish constituency in Westminster, London. Ignatius voted for the successful candidates at this time. They were Lord Thomas Pelham Clinton and Hugh, Earl Percy, both of whom were British Army officers who had served in the American Revolutionary War. They stood in this election for the party that was already governing the country, the party which was being led by Lord North as the Prime Minister. The other candidates, who did not secure Ignatius's vote, represented the more radical opposition. As we discussed earlier, it was just a few years after this election, in 1779, that Ignatius would choose to dedicate his publication of a collection of his musical compositions to Lord North's daughter, which may perhaps be taken as a sign of his continued support for North's governance, and even for North's wider family. If this is the case, it does seem that just a year later, things have changed. Because by the election of 1780, Ignatius is voting for George Bridges Rodney and Charles James Fox. Now again, he is backing the winners. But in casting a vote for Fox, Ignatius is supporting an enemy of Lord North. Fox was heavily and publicly critical of Lord North's policies in regards to the American Wars of Independence. Indeed, he went further still. Fox voiced his support for the American cause, in addition to continuing his habit of being vocally critical of King George III. Voting in the way he did on this occasion also meant withdrawing his support from Thomas Pelham Clinton, who was running again and who Ignatius had voted for in the previous election. So, should we take this as a sign of Ignatius undergoing a profound shift in political thought, that he moved towards the radical between 1774 and 1780, or even between 1779, when he's dedicating that text to Lord North's daughter, and the following year, 1780? Had Thomas Pelham Clinton, or even Lord North, done something to displease him? Perhaps. However, I think it's worth pointing out that Ignatius did know Fox personally, as Fox frequented the grocery shop as a customer. Fox was known to be a convincing speaker, charismatic and eloquent. Fox would also become one of the leading campaigners in the abolitionist movement, and so maybe Ignatius was won over by one or all of these things about Fox. Despite his financial success and elevated social standing, Ignatius was still on the receiving end of discrimination and abuse because of the colour of his skin. Ignatius's friend, the artist William Stevenson, recounted how they were, quote, walking through Spring Gardens Passage when, a small distance from before us, a young fashionable said to his companion, loud enough to be heard, "Smoke, Othello." This did not escape my friend Sancho, who immediately placed himself across the path before him, exclaimed with a thundering voice and a countenance which awed the delinquent, "Ay, sir, such Othellos you meet with but once in a century," clapping his hand upon his goodly round paunch. "Such Iagos as you we meet with in every dirty passage. Proceed, sir." Ignatius Sancho died on the 14th of December, 1780. Many reports list his cause of death as gout, which to my knowledge was not usually fatal, but upon further research it can apparently, in rare cases when untreated, lead to other problems that can in fact prove deadly. Ignatius was buried at St Margaret's in Westminster. The day after his death, the Gazetteer published his obituary as follows, quote, "About 6 yesterday morning died suddenly Mr Ignatius Sancho, grocer and tea dealer of Charles Street, Westminster, a man whose generosity and benevolence were far beyond his humble station. He was honoured with the friendship of the late Reverend Mr Sterne, and several of the literati of these times. It is believed that Ignatius was the first person of African descent to get an obituary in the British press. 2 years after his death, a 2-volume collection of letters of the late Ignatius Sancho, an African, was sold by subscription. According to Vincent Coretta, quote, "The subscription list for the first edition of the letters reflects the great range of Sancho's social circle. Men and women, aristocrats, servants, artists, businessmen, country squires, and prominent politicians. The ease and respect with which he communicates with his correspondents, no matter how much they differ from him in age or social status, account for much of the appeal of the tone of his letters. Even though his own status rose, he never lost contact with those who had been his fellow servants, some of whom were also fellow Afro-Britons. The letters themselves were used as evidence to support the arguments being made by the anti-slavery abolitionist movement. The evident literary quality of these letters was offered as a proof of the shared capabilities, sensibilities, and ultimately humanity of African people. This was something that those who continued to support slavery believed might be debatable. Ignatius Sancho's evident skills simply ran counter to the idea that Europeans were in some or any way inherently superior. He was also able to provide his readers with his experience of being enslaved, to show them the damage and harm that it caused. The subscriptions that were paid for the publication of this collection of his letters went to support his widow Anne. From it, she received £500. If we check that currency converter once again, we find that £500 in 1780 is the equivalent of £43,052.25, or at the time, 3,333 days of wages for a skilled tradesman. In 2007, this plaque was installed in Greenwich Park, on the site of the former Montagu house. It reads as follows, quote, "Ignatius Sancho, circa 1729 to 1780, African man of letters, composer and opponent of slavery. Born on a slave ship, he was encouraged to educate himself by John, 2nd Duke of Montagu, and served as a butler to the Duchess here in Montagu House. More recently, another application has been submitted to install another plaque at this site, it is suggested this plaque will look like this. The application states, quote, "The square sculpture with central oval relief portrait will be made in fired ceramic. The sculpted portrait area and oval border with symbols of Ignatius Sancho's African origin are in colour. This gives focus to the portrait as a visual enhancement to the existing plaque. The square surround is close in colour and size to the existing worded plaque below it about Sancho and his local and historical context." I certainly hope that this application will be successful. I think it would be a brilliant addition, and if it is, I will of course make sure to let you all know. In fact, if/when this new installation takes place, this plaque is revealed, I will be making my way down to Greenwich to check it out for myself in person, and of course, if that happens, I will take you all with me to share in the experience. So what do you think of Ignatius Sancho, of his life and legacy, and of the new plaque that is being suggested as a way to honour him? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. I'd also love it if you could pop an emoji or social glyph in the comments too, because the more engagement a video gets, the more YouTube sees it as something that people are enjoying, and that inspires the YouTube algorithm to share the video out further, which in turn will help us to grow this community. As we have been talking about a composer, how about you pick a musical emoji, anyone you fancy, and pop that in the comments this time. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope that you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with your friends? In fact, if you like my channel more generally, let some pals know about it. You can tell me that you like this particular video by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel, and if you think you're subscribed, have a little check just right now, we've got time. Make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will, because for some reason the platform does like to do that. While you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear, and that way, allegedly, YouTube will tell you both when I've next uploaded, but also when I am planning on going live, in particular those regular history news updates that I'm sure you are not going to want to miss. I hope that you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.